Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group. It is Saturday, the 4th of April, and you're joined by myself, Philip Nothard.
And me, Curtis Hutchinson. So the virtual studio has been pretty busy this week, hasn't it, Phil?
Yeah, I think, we can't. It's interesting, isn't it, that the amount of webinars and other things done now in that digital space, and I mean, my diary's never been as full with Teams meetings, Zoom meetings, and Skype meetings. But it's all good. It's all good. There's a lot of sharing of insight and knowledge and things going on. But we've had some good interviews so far, haven't we?
We have, yeah. We've for those who haven't caught up with our specials, we've recorded two specials this week on Monday and Wednesday. Monday's was with Umesh Samani from the IMDA, and on Wednesday we spoke to Mike Jones, the chairman of ASC, and two different perspectives because obviously Umesh was talking about independence, what the lockdown means to independence, and how they're managing this down period, and Mike Jones obviously talking about more on the franchise sector, but the operational issues that businesses are addressing at the moment.
Yeah, and we have got a story, haven't we, that supports some of that views of Mike as well this week that's appeared in AO Online. But both good interviews, like you say. Umesh is also giving a opposing view or similar view in many cases to the other interview with Robert Forrester, because he was talking just before the shutdown, wasn't he, the week before? Yes. Around that. So it's quite interesting because we needed to try and get that sort of balance and see how the independent dealers were, shutting down and operating through that period as well. So both very good interviews. In fact, all three of them are fantastic interviews, and the feedback has been excellent and very positive about all three of them, actually.
Yeah, and they're all still available, online. So do visit them. And in fact, the Mike Jones interview, what we'll do is we'll add it to the end of this program. So if you haven't heard it, just stay tuned and listen to it later.
And the other one is definitely worth mentioning. Is again recorded recently outside of the Saturday headlines, is that one that we did on the mental health, wasn't it? Special there with Rachel from Ben, Craig Maley from Cox Automotive, and Gary Barker, who's done the cancer journey as well. That was a very useful and insightful interview, that, wasn't it, with us? So very testing IT wise, but very, very interesting interview indeed.
Yeah, and definitely worth revisiting because it is timeless, and especially the problems we're all facing at the moment with the coronavirus pandemic. It's worth tuning in and listening to that one because there are a lot of useful pointers on that.
And say we've got the interview at the end there with Mike Jones from ASC, but we have got a few headlines this week, haven't we? And it's trying to pick through some of the sort of headline grabbing coronavirus headlines and trying to look for some of the stories within it. But we have got a number of good interesting stories this week.
We have, yeah. So starting with car dealer, the headline is Major Boost to Car Dealers as Government Revises Business Interruption Loan Scheme. So this is an update on the loans. So it's the £25 million loans that the government introduced as part of their packages last week. It was only last week. Initially, it covered businesses up to a turnover of £45 million. But on Friday, this was extended to businesses with turnovers up to 500 million. So to give that a bit of context, under the initial package would only have covered it was 14 groups within the most traded top 200 who had turnovers of up to 45 million. So by opening it up, that obviously captures a lot more dealers, a lot more dealer groups. So that's been welcomed by the industry.
Yeah, definitely, and that story's in Car Dealer there from UHY, isn't it, with David Kendrick talking about it there, and we sort of touched on this point in the next story as well, but David does talk about that it still remains kind of unknown as to how long this will go on for. We are in that period of the unknown again, but would encourage everybody to consider the government support during these times, and I'm sure everybody will be doing that, regardless of their funding position, as ultimately he's talking that cash will be king, and we do talk about that next, don't we, in terms of that stock liquidation and cash flow and things like this. But there is a lot going on. There's a lot for the dealers to get their heads around in the market at the minute, of what grants are available to them, how to apply for them, if the systems are actually up and running for them to supply. There's the option of obviously deferment of VAT submissions and things like this. So there's a lot for the dealer market to get their head around, isn't there?
There's a lot to digest at the moment. There really is. And as you say, the next story is from AM Online, and the headline is "Avoid Stock Liquidation. ASE warns dealers as cash flow remains key." And this is a point that's picked up by Mike Jones in our interview with him. The importance of cash flows. So what he's saying in the story is really advising dealers not to buy more stock at the moment, which you wouldn't expect them to, but also to hold on to whatever used stock they have, which will present some dealers with a dilemma, because they will want to realize that stock and get some cash back into the business, but obviously selling at the moment is problematical.
Yeah, and it's a continual conversation that I'm having across the market, that it's that liquidation, it's that cash flow that is the bigger driver with this. We've talked around cap HPI holding the values steady, taking a very pragmatic view on that stability of the trade values. They've talked, as we mentioned, that they're not going to start reflecting the transactions until volumes return to a normal level or near to normal level. But it's easy said that when you've got businesses, large and small, that are sat on very heavy asset values on the balance sheet there. They're obviously doing their best in terms of either suppliers and their colleagues, their staff, to make sure that they get looked after. There is this issue around the furlough, the 80% of salary up to 2,500 for employees, that they, when they get that money back off the government, is still under discussion. I believe it's, they're talking as soon as possible to get the systems up and running. But again, it is that cash flow, isn't it? There's costs going out with no revenue coming in. You've got all these assets sat there, and what we don't want to happen, and there is a lot of conversation across the market about this, that because of cash flow challenges, that it starts to stimulate a heavy market depreciation of value. And there's a lot of activity taking place in the retail market around pricing. A lot of questions around the pricing at the minute, in terms of whether dealers are starting to reduce the pricing. I suppose the question is actually, as you said, that how soon you're going to be able to realise that cash at the end of the day. You can take a £99 deposit, but if you can't transact and you can't finalise that deal, and you can't hand that car over and take the part exchange or get paid out on the finance, it doesn't really mean anything at this minute. But I don't know, it's questionable, and it's a tough one for dealers to be sat in the middle of.
It is tough, and dealers face a real dilemma at the moment with what's going on in the wider world. A lot of car buyers are spending their time online. They're looking at cars, and they're generating leads through to dealerships, and dealers are collecting these leads and what do they do with them? Because clearly they want to sell their stock, but they're not allowed to. So.
Yeah, and in the story there is some interesting insight in there, isn't there? Because they've looked at some of the analyst work from IHS market, and they've predicted a year-on-year 10 million light vehicle sales decline of 12.2% worldwide to 78.8 million units in 2020 due to the coronavirus pandemic. So there's a but again, it comes back to this question of how long this restriction period stays for, isn't it? As to the longevity of the impact. Month one, there is an element of people working from home or on furlough. There's then an element of how long they are on furlough for, and it's and then you've obviously got this. At what point, and it's a challenge for the government probably in terms of stimulation of the economy, but the longer we're in heavy lockdown and heavy restrictions, then there's a balance of actually nobody's really spending much to a certain extent, because you can't go anywhere, spend anything. Holidays, I don't know what your view is on holiday. I mean, you've only just come back, but luckily just in time. Luckily just in time there, Curtis.
Yeah. Not only did I manage to get away, but I managed to get back as well.
Yeah, luckily, you could have timed that a bit differently, but yeah. But potentially, when restrictions are lifted, will people be spending their money on holidays that they had put to one side for the holiday? Possibly not. That could stimulate some demand, couldn't it? But again, it's how long this goes on for and what the consumer confidence and consumer debt will look like when we come out at the back end of this is probably the biggest question. There is going to be potentially, pent up demand for new and used vehicles when we come out of this. So I don't know. There's a lot of conversation at the minute taking place, and the reality is nobody really knows because there's nothing to compare it to. No. In history around this. It is unique in what is happening.
So you're listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group, the only weekly podcast serving the car retailing sector, and available online at motortraderadio.com and by subscribing free of charge to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Deezer, and SoundCloud.
We're still on them. Yeah, lots going on there. So the next story actually does lead in quite well in terms of the last two. It is unfortunately COVID-19 related, but it's Alison Jones who is the MD of PSA Group UK, and this is a story that's been published in AM Online. It's been a very popular story, hasn't it, Curtis? And since it was published, and the headline is that PSA Group UK MD Alison Jones is quoted, "We're planning for 96% car sales decline." Now, putting that into context, she is talking about a 96% vehicle sales decline during the lockdown restriction period. Now, me and you were talking before this, weren't we? It was kind of thinking about, well, that's really, to a certain extent, bearing in mind we're on lockdown and restricted travel and essential workers activity only, there's a positive there that there is still 4% activity taking place.
Yeah, which I can only guess must be the online channels, but again, we've got that issue of fulfillment, so you can only go so far without actually taking delivery of the car. So a bit of an odd one, that.
Yeah, and I think there is talk. I mean, we've had Robert Forrester on recently around that sort of sales activity. Other dealer groups have talked around orders being taken, albeit low in terms of leads and orders. Again, as you say, it's that fulfillment. Some of this activity might actually be essential worker fulfillment. in terms of vehicles being put on the road for essential workers. Possibly, I'm not 100% sure, but there is a comparison to China, because they do talk in the story about the Chinese market. It caused a domestic sales drop to drop 96% in the first week of February, whilst overall February fell 80% year on year, according to the China Passenger Car Association. Now, I have heard reports that the Chinese market was 1.8 million in January, dropped to 250,000 in February, and then has returned to circa a million in March. And I don't know, is that a comparison to make? Is the question probably, I think, that everybody's asking. Is there is, in terms of learnings, there's probably only China to look at the minute.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, it's the only benchmark we've got at the moment, isn't it? We're just starting to get figures through from other European countries, but yeah, we're pretty much on a par in terms of where we are with the pandemic, give or take a couple of weeks here and there. So China is the one that I guess a lot of, certainly the OEMs and a lot of dealers will be looking at for any trends.
Yeah, I mean, there is, going further into the story there, they do talk about key workers being prioritised for vehicle orders. So they talk about PSA and many of its retailers have sort of shifted to selling cars online, exactly what we said earlier. It could be some time before orders are fulfilled, as the government has asked, obviously, manufacturers not to hand over cars, as that is classed as non-essential activity. But they do talk about the exception is vehicle orders for key workers, such as van drivers, and PSA has said that they were being prioritised during the crisis. So potentially there is still some activity taking place in that van market, for essential workers and key workers throughout this period. So it does kind of give a little bit of insight there that there is still some handovers and some transactions taking place.
Yeah, and there is a sort of passing remark on the March market, which is quite interesting here, speculating that it'll be down by between 30 and 40%. Now, we'll know the figure on Monday when it's released, but talking about benchmarks, there'll be nothing to compare this with. I mean, it's no good doing year-on-year comparisons.
I know, and I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing when I'm looking at month on month, year on year, when this is all over and done with. It's going to be a bit of a challenge. That I've just been talking to some people today. It's kind of, there isn't activity, and looking at some of the online activity, and there's a view that the online activity is in a comparison to what you tend to see over the Christmas period, where people become a bit bored. So they not necessarily heavily in the market for purchasing, but actually, revert to the classifieds to do a little bit of sort of searching and a little bit of interest looking around at the sites, because they've probably had enough of Netflix, Amazon Prime, and they've cleaned the house, they've done the gardening and done a few chores around, and potentially we might see a little bit more of that as we move through this period, because that people will become a little bit more bored and start going back online and looking for things and doing a bit of research. So you never know, at the end of this we could see an upturn in certain areas where people have used this time to do some research, such as autonomous and EV and alternative fuel vehicles and things like this, that there's probably time for consumers to do a bit of research in those areas. So one that we'll see when we come out at the end of this.
Yeah. Now, the next story follows on from an interview we only did last week, but it's already starting to feel like a long time ago. So the headline is from Motor Trader, and it's Virtue opens vast majority of service centres for emergency workers. Now, we interviewed Robert Forrester last week, 2 or 3 hours before the whole of the Virtue network was due to close. So this story is really picking up on what the next step is. And this is Virtue opening the vast majority of service departments across the group, and this is to ensure that key workers and vehicles critical to the country during the pandemic can continue their work. So it's a good story, this one.
It is, and I know that Robert has been public in saying that it was a challenge initially to try and identify those customers, and I suppose how one is identifying those customers in your database, isn't it, that are a key essential worker, and to get that work done. I mean, it's hats off that the staff involved with this, and I think Robert talks about his general manager's daily principles being on site every day to support their employees that are going into work to do this. I mean, it's fantastic that they're doing it, and it's brilliant, the support that everybody's giving through this unprecedented period that we're going through. But again, it's keeping the guys on the road, keeping those essential workers, key workers on the road, keeping everything maintained. And like you say, Robert sort of shut everything down, didn't he, very quickly? And I think he did allude to that they went down to a very quick shutdown, and then took a little bit of time just to look at what they were going to do and how they were going to manage this. And like you say, he came out fairly quickly, didn't it, after the interview, that he did do this. So again, probably first of a few that are doing that for the customers.
Yeah, and it's well worth revisiting that interview or visiting it for the first time if you haven't heard it, because Robert talks about how they had a plan in place, and they had a plan to close the network, but they brought it forward by, I think it was 24 hours after the government announced the shutdown. So it was fast-moving events there, and it was fascinating seeing how a group the size of Virtue was responding very much on the hoof.
No, and as you said right at the start, we've got a bit of a roundup as well, haven't we? Because there is a lot of stories, and a lot of good stories, and a lot of good work being done across the sector to support the position that people are finding themselves in. So we've done a little bit of a roundup, haven't we, of some of the stories that might be worth having a quick look for, some of the shout outs for the things that have hit the social media and the headlines that we're not talking about in detail.
Yeah, and it is a roundup. These are just a handful that we saw. So apologies if we don't cover whatever you're doing. But the first one is Vauxhall have pledged free roadside assistance to all NHS staff who drive one of its cars during the coronavirus crisis. And the offer is extended to any Vauxhall vehicle, regardless of age or mileage. And we found that one in Motoring Research.
Yeah, and similar to what we were just talking about there with Virtue, that Sytners opens 30 workshops across England and Wales to support key workers again of the within the coronavirus period, and that was a story that appeared on LinkedIn.
Yeah, and the next one is Truss Ford have switched its network of mobile service vans to prioritise NHS frontline services and essential fleets. And that was a post we saw from Stuart Folds, the CEO and chairman of Truss Ford, and that was on LinkedIn as well.
That's an interesting one, that one, isn't it? Because we did have Stuart on, didn't we, on the podcast a few months ago. A very enlightening interview there with Stuart, and he's sharing some of what they were doing as a group in terms of their restructuring of the network and moving into all these mobile service vans and things like this. So it's fantastic they're putting that to good use within these challenging times. And moving on to the next one, there is 62 Marshall Motor Group, that is, workshops operational across the country to support key workers, emergency services and CV operators during COVID-19 period. And that was a post from Dash Gupta on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, and the last one in our roundup is Snow's Motor Group are keeping some workshops open across the south of England for NHS workers, emergency services, military and key workers. And that one was covered by Motor Trader.
So the final story of the week is one that actually supports the above to a certain extent, but something slightly different. And this is a story that's actually on BBC. And this is that garage owners sleepover plan to help NHS workers. And this is a story picked up, like I say, from the BBC, but it's about the Knox Brothers garage with owner Alan Knox that has already sent his 9-strong workforce home in the wake of the coronavirus outbreak, but obviously doing something to support now the key workers.
Yeah, it's a lovely story, this. I actually shared it on LinkedIn, and it had a lot of views, so there's a lot of interest in this one. Now, his business is actually based next to a hospital in East Kilbride, so a lot of his customers work at the hospital, so he's staying on site. So he's self-isolating himself on site to protect his family and opening to help NHS and key workers, and a lot of medics who are sort of returning to work from retirement or whatever. So, yeah, what a great effort here from Alan Knox.
Yeah, I know. So there's some fantastic stuff taking place in there. You see on the news every day, don't you, that what people are doing to support the key workers and the challenges that these people are facing. And you've got to commend those people at the minute that are at the front line doing all this, haven't you, across the industry. And fantastic that this isn't about the automotive sector. This is about everybody helping those in need through this, and it's fantastic news for everybody.
Yeah, and really a shout out to anyone listening. If you are doing anything that you'd like us to cover on next week's podcast, then just let us know. Message us on social media. You know where to find us.
Yeah, definitely. So that's it for this week, isn't it, Curtis? So
it is,
we have got some more specials lined up for next week. Hopefully, again, some fascinating interviews lined up, and hopefully some very insightful what people are doing and stuff to share as well on the podcast. So do stay tuned and keep listening in.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've been listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group, the only weekly podcast serving the car retailing sector. Many thanks, everyone, for tuning in today. Do join Phil and I again next weekend. And as Phil says, look out for any special interviews that we'll post over the course of the coming week. Until then, do stay tuned for a special interview we recorded earlier in the week with ASC PLC Chairman Mike Jones.
Hello and welcome from me, Philip Nothard, and Curtis Hutchinson to this special COVID-19 Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group.
Many thanks for joining us for this latest in our series of special interviews with industry leaders during the COVID-19 crisis. Today's special follows our conversation last week with Virtue Motors CEO Robert Forrester and our chat earlier this week with the IMDA chairman Umesh Samani, both of which are still available to stream online. Our special guest this morning is Mike Jones, chairman of ASC. Welcome back to the podcast, Mike. And how's home working going for you?
A little bit of the pressure has gone now that we're no longer homeschooling and the kids are on Easter break. But no, everybody's healthy, which is the important thing, trying to do the best to get the information out whilst also making sure everybody stays inside and stays healthy.
Yeah, and obviously you've been talking to a lot of dealer owners and managers since last week's lockdown started. What's your take on the mood in the dealer community at the moment?
I mean, we're all clearly dealing with unprecedented times. We can't really hark back to anything. The banking crisis, we were able to trade through. It was a challenge for everybody, but we could trade through it. So I think everybody's a little bit scared as to what the future might hold. Now, that's changing as we get more used to it. People get a better plan as to what they think is going to happen, have a variety of contingencies in there. But there's been an overwhelming desire amongst the people that I've been chatting to who are looking to protect the staff, protect the customers and help out wherever they can. So the first action has been to sort of close down and then almost start again and work out where we can help the economy and the key workers. From an ASC point of view, people are clearly very hungry for information. They've been asking us a huge stream of questions. some of which we've got the answers to, some of which we can give a best guess on the basis the government haven't defined it because they're drawing these things up quite so quickly. So no, we've been putting out lots of discussions, web pages, blogs, etc., plus doing interviews like this to try and provide some information and give people some guidance, because I think the one thing that's most important during all of this is that everybody continues to communicate and we work out the best way through this.
No, you're right, and as we were talking before the show, I mean, it's an ever changing. It's changing at such a fast rate, isn't it? With new things coming out all the time to help with businesses and other things that's happening. So, I mean, clearly there, Mike, I mean, it's not the right time to talk about dealer profitability. It's more of a time, as you mentioned there, about cash flow. And on the subject of cash flow, I mean, what advice are you giving dealers at the minute in the best way to manage their cash flow throughout this sort of evolving crisis on a day-by-day basis, really?
Yeah, I mean, cash will, particularly at the moment, be king, and people are working really on sort of three different streams, getting in all the cash that they can now, increasing the headroom that they've got and the facilities that they've got available, and then reducing their outgoings. I mean, with regards to getting the cash in, people are drawing down on funding lines. The majority of the funders are being supportive, as long as people aren't going out actively buying stock at the moment, albeit I did hear of one yesterday, a funder looking at reducing funding lines, which is really not very helpful at this particular moment in time. People are looking at increasing the headroom. Most of the government support from a loan point of view is provided through the banks, so people are producing sort of 3 and 6 month cash flows, worst case scenarios, even worst case scenarios, planning for the government support to be late from a furlough point of view, speaking to the bank to try and work that way through it and give themselves some headroom and some facilities. And people are also cutting back on outgoings, not paying anything that they don't have to, furloughing the vast majority of staff. As I said, albeit I think we need to plan for there being a little gap between when we need to pay the staff out and when the money will come in from the government. But most people are sort of adopting a don't pay it, don't pay bills now position to then be in a position to argue about it further on down the line. Picking the key things that they absolutely need to keep going and working on that. We're then working with people as well as to what we think the cash flow implications will be of when we open back up. We've got a lot of March deliveries that are still to be done. That has a cash flow implication. Plus, we've got the catch up. And historically, we tend to find that new cars might take a little while to wake back up once we're all allowed out and about again. Service, again, takes a little bit of time to sort of prime the service department. It's very difficult when you can't plan for an opening date as to when you can start booking things in, but we usually find that used cars moves really quite quickly. So it's planning what the cash flow implications are of that and how people can best look forward to a return to normal retailing.
And have you, sorry, just before I move on to the next bit there, but just on the in terms of the cash flow, and obviously there's support coming out from the government and house of claim and things like that. Have you heard anything? Because I think there's been a little bit of sort of rumours that it's not an easy process in some cases, and there are obviously lots of challenges, because as we were talking before the show, that it's kind of get the decision out and then sort the detail out later in some cases. Have you heard anything on that, or in terms of the banks and the processes and for these grants and things like this? Because there is a bit of pushback on this, I think, at the minute, isn't there, that it's not that easy because not everything is set up and in place for the support.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with regards to the loans, albeit it's an issue we might come on to later on, that a lot of motor retailers don't actually fit the criteria for them. You've got to go through your existing bank, and they've basically got it. They've spent ever since the financial crisis. They've been working on giving people lower overdrafts and only lending to people who they think are sound. And now they've suddenly got to get £330 billion into the market, either through the loans or the paper scheme that they've got with regards to the corporate finance facility. So they're just being, the banks credit teams, etc., are being absolutely inundated with requests for extensions to existing facilities, and they're having to make the rules up as they go as well. I mean, overnight I've spoken to the heads of two of the bigger banks, or the motor retail arms of two of the bigger banks, who also look after a lot of the funding facilities, to find where they're at, and they're grappling with the as we have with a variety of other things, they're grappling with a lack of clarity as to exactly what it is they're supposed to do. So they're just doing the best that they possibly can to try and support everybody. We've seen it with, one of the items that hit the press was with regards to whether there were personal guarantees on these loans. I mean, NatWest RBS came out relatively quickly and said they weren't doing it, and then a variety of the other banks then had to sort of follow suit that they weren't taking PGs on loans under £100,000. So they are. This is evolving very, very rapidly. I mean, it's only just over a week since we all went home. And if you think the amount of things that have changed over the course of that time, it's huge. And we've got to expect some of this to be worked out over time. The one thing retailers need to do from a cash flow point of view is just try and make sure they've got sufficient headroom for that period whilst it's all worked out, until the cash effectively comes back into their bank.
Yeah.
Now, Mike, we know garages are exempt from the lockdown. Can you share your thoughts on how the dealers you're talking to are tackling the issue of after sales, and whether they should be open for anything other than assisting key workers and NHS staff? And also be interested to hear your take on whether you think the 6-month MOT exemption is what was actually required.
I mean, I think from the dealers that I've been speaking to a lot over the course of the last week, they're sort of they're trying to be supportive wherever they can, whilst also looking after their staff. So a lot of them closed and then worked out how they could reopen. We're looking for volunteers as to who wanted to continue to work, to try and make sure that we can continue to keep the emergency services vehicles on the road, and also look at the key workers, whilst also making sure that people are only taking risks that they're happy with from an employee point of view. Some businesses have come out with alternative solutions, so they're using their rental car fleets, their courtesy car fleets, etc., for key workers whose cars are broken down, so they don't have to worry about repairing them at the moment. They can just take a free vehicle for the period, which for me seems a very moral standpoint. I mean, some of the independents are very much trying for business as usual, but I have a moral issue with that from a brutally personal point of view. I think there's a big difference between whether they can open and whether they should open. We're all in this together, and we've got to try and reduce the spread of this thing so that the NHS can cope and we don't flood it with a load of people who need emergency care. And I personally think we should only be delivering face-to-face the minimum that we absolutely have to do to keep the official show on the road. As far as the MOT exemption is concerned, I think it was good that it came out. It was, again, as with all these things, there's always bits that fall between the gap. I had a car that was due to be MOT'd on the 29th of March that still had to be MOT'd. So that car was still, all the 30th of March the end of March registrations from 3 years ago, they all need to be MOT'd. We've got issues with regards to whether those cars are still on PCP, whether they're with the customers, etc. So there was a bit of a hump, but I think it's vital that we, from a wider point of view, we don't go out and do unnecessary things. There are gaps in there. There's issues with regards to if you're driving around and you're out of MOT, then you're certifying that the car's roadworthy. Well, what happens if you have a crash, etc., etc. But they're running around trying to deliver all different things for every single bit of the economy, and I think the government's doing its best, albeit that there are some gaps in what they're putting out there.
Yeah, it was something we discussed with Robert Forrester the other week, and again with Umish, that it's whether the 6 month is right or wrong. But it was, if you listen to the two interviews, I mean, Robert was talking about, before we knew that there was a request in to government about doing something about the issue around MOTs, and then by the time we interviewed Umish, it had gone through and the 6 month had been made, the decision had been made. Now, whether it was right or wrong, it was a case of they did something, didn't they? They acted and they did something for the industry. So no, it's a difficult one. And just touching back on, not necessarily just on the cash flow, but thinking about the dealers specifically around this, is what are you advising in terms of packages that are available? And we know that things are changing, and they are, every day we wait for any updates from the government. But as of now, what packages really should be the dealers be thinking about and really applying for at the minute?
I mean, the big one that the whole industry is moving towards is the what they call the coronavirus job retention scheme, which is the ability to furlough people with the government effectively reimbursing 80% of the wages up to $2,500 a month. The vast majority of the motor sector is now in this, or the retail sector is in this bucket. We've been forced to close showrooms, and the majority of staff have been furloughed. We need to make sure that people aren't providing services or generating revenue. There's an issue in that the people must have been employed at the end of February. So anybody who switched job at the start of March then has to go back to their previous employer and trying to get retaken on and furloughed there, which is a challenge. But this is going to be the one that is works for the majority of the trade. There are a number of issues in there. They haven't yet issued the portal out that we need to apply for the income through. So the question is, when's that going to come out, and therefore when are we going to get the check back in? There's a question around what is earnings, particularly from a salesperson point of view. From an ASE standpoint, the guidance, the government guidance, is contradictory in a couple of different areas, and we believe that we'll ultimately end back where the legal cases have defined earnings over many years, and we do with holiday pay, where the normal commissions of a salesperson are included within their salary. It's included within their earnings as far as the UK law is concerned. So we think we'll end up back there, albeit there's a number of people seeking clarity on that. But no, most people are going after the furloughing of employees for the 3-week period. Then we touched on it earlier on, the business interruption loan. In theory, that would be brilliant for an awful lot of the motor trade. The problem is that there's a £45 million turnover maximum on that loan, and the vast majority of dealers and dealer groups are in excess of that 45 million. So in theory, they can't at the moment apply for it. The facility out there for larger businesses, the corporate financing facility, requires you to issue paper, get credit ratings, etc. The public companies might be able to do that, but the private ones are too far behind the curve, I would imagine. So we could do with the government extending the £45 million, albeit that they haven't done that over the course of the last week. Other things they need to do is rates for the smaller businesses. They may need to, you'll get a business rates holiday. There's rates rebates for the smaller businesses, and the council is supposed to contact you to give the rebate. I wouldn't rely on that. I was advising somebody yesterday, a small business, and their council have put up a form that you need to fill in. So you had to go online onto their website, download a form, fill it in, and send it back. So that's completely in contravention as to what the government said was supposed to happen. But so I would make sure that people are in touch where they qualify to try and make sure that they get these rebates. We're deferring VAT, so this quarter's VAT shouldn't be payable, albeit we need to cancel the direct debit to make sure that they don't need to. The government doesn't take the funds. People are applying for time to pay arrangements, as they've always been able to on other government payments. There's a support scheme for the self-employed, which I know hits a certain part of the motor retail sector. We can get SSP paid, and there's cash grants for smaller businesses. So there's a huge raft of different things that people can apply for. The rules aren't exactly perfect at the moment, and certainly with regards to furloughing, I think we're going to be making a claim and then almost arguing about it further on down the line. But in the nicest possible way, if we're still in business and in a position to argue on it further on down the line, then people have done a good job.
Yeah.
Now, Mike, one of the first things I noticed last week when I ventured out for my first run after the lockdown was just how quickly my local, it was Ford and Honda dealers had moved to clear their forecourts of used cars. Is this something that you've advised dealers to do? And what's your best advice in what dealers should be doing, I guess, in terms of their stock during the lockdown?
I mean, people very rightly and very quickly move to physically secure the stock. If we're not going to have anybody on site, or to enable us not to have anybody on site, we obviously need to make sure that the cars are out of the way. And so people have, where they can, people have done that. Alternatively, they need security arrangements to make sure the cars are all kept okay. We're talking about having signs in the windows, basically telling people that we've taken all the keys and the V5s home for any cars that are physically there. With regards to what they should be doing, and we've seen this around the world, but we need to make sure we're keeping the online presence and interacting with customers as we go through. It's a little bit like we have on an annual basis at Christmas, where people get Christmas Day out the way. They're then stuck with the family for another week, and so they start surfing for cars online. And then we get a reasonably fast start in January when people are all back and awake. And that's very much what we've seen overseas, and also very much what we're expecting in the UK as we go through and people have got over the shock of being at home and the fact that the world's changed. Then the digital channels do open up, and we can start building a pipeline for when we are allowed to start back. We can take deposits, we can book people in, we can sell cars for delivery later, with the right level of sort of online interaction. And the danger is that you cut absolutely everything back to the bone. And I think it's important that we keep communicating with customers, and we keep being able to help them through this crisis, and also build a pipeline for when we come out the other side.
Yeah. So they should really be carrying on managing their incoming leads as they would normally.
Yeah, and we've actually seen, well, I think people need to do it based on demand, but we've seen overseas where they've had to actually bring additional people into the online teams and the call center teams to cope with the volume of traffic and the volume of interaction. But they just need to make sure they're monitoring it and make sure they've got enough people manning the computers and manning the phones to get back to customers in a timely manner. Because I mean, we're impatient at the best of times, but if we're just sitting around with nothing else to do, then I would imagine the response times have got to be really quite rapid, and there will be a big prize out there for the people who can get back quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And thinking about recovery and exit out of this, that ASC do operate globally, and I know you've got offices in Italy, Spain, but you've also got offices in China and the US. And we know China, there's been a lot of news about China on the quickly shut down, obviously, at Chinese New Year, and there's activity now back in China. Are there any learnings that you can share that you've got from any of those operations that you're in, particularly with China, to the audience?
Yeah, I mean, China's clearly the furthest ahead with regards to this. They were the first to lock down, and they did it in a relatively brutal and fast way, albeit they were all working remotely. And when we saw in January they did 1.8 million cars. In February they did 250,000. So a massive drop. We've seen in March, we haven't got the final numbers through, but it looks like they're going to be hitting around 1 million. So there's been a relatively sharp bounce back, which I know was reassuring to people here. And from the discussions that we've had with the brands over in China, they're still looking to hit the level of sales that they were originally planning for 2020, or certainly from a public point of view in the discussions with us. So That's relatively reassuring. We saw the retailers getting quite innovative in how they were working remotely and doing remote handovers, use of drones, and things like that. But we also saw a raft of people building an online presence through providing advice on YouTube, etc., and generally priming the market so that they were building with the number of customers they'd been speaking to, but with also from a brand side an awful lot of incentive money to make sure we had that fast start. The one learning we have had as well from some of the European markets is just making sure you read the mood of the market. Everybody's desperate to try and keep income coming in, but I think if you're seen to do the wrong thing, then people will remember it. And there is a spirit out there at the moment where people need to make sure that they time those sort of go-to-market, we're getting back ready to open up again messages for the right time when the sort of mood music's working in that direction.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, I think your point there about reading the mood of the market is absolutely crucial. And many thanks for joining us today and sharing your perspective on some of the many concerns facing dealers at this difficult time and how they're managing their businesses during the lockdown and the sort of practical things they can keep on doing during the lockdown. So, many thanks for sharing that with us.
No problem at all, and thank you for the invite. I mean, from my point of view and from ASC's point of view, we're just trying to get as much information out there as we can to help people through it. We're putting lots of stuff and continually updated guidance on our website in the resources section, and also on our LinkedIn pages, just to try and get the information out there. The government helps changing so quickly. We need to update on that, but also some operational guidance as to what people can do now. And we're soon launching a sort of back to work guide, as in how people prime the market and what they do immediately as they start. We're obviously helping people put together cash flows and loan applications. So if anybody needs any help, then please feel free to get in touch. I think it's vital that we get as much information out as we possibly can, but obviously it's also most important that everybody stays safe. So it's good to hear you guys both so healthy, and hopefully that stays that way.
No, same to you, Mike. Same to you. It's been an absolute pleasure as always, and I think we'll probably get you back on at some stage, depending on how long we start to. We're in lockdown for, but we'll, there's still advice there, and as you say, that back to work guide is going to be essential, isn't it? Because it's like you say, it's reading the market and doing the right things. We know that coming into the shutdown, as a business, Cox Automotive, is moving from physical to digital and then shut down entirely, and it's how then that goes back into and is it the new norm? It's not. People are talking about back to normality, but we're potentially going to be into a new norm, aren't we, at the end of all this? So it's going to be essential that, as you say, everyone keeps talking and keeps sharing the knowledge. So it's been an absolute pleasure as always, Mike. So you've been listening to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. So please like and share on social media, as it's important during these times, as Mike has just said there, for the dealer community to come together and share their experiences. So that's all from Curtis and I, and we'll be back as normal on Saturday with the industry headlines. But watch out for more special podcasts and interviews as we work through this crisis together. So again, thank you for tuning in, and please stay safe, everybody.